From the darkest reaches of space to the deepest corners of your mind. Welcome to From the Void.
For decades, we've been told the story ends the same way. Berlin, 1945. A bunker, a pistol, a cyanide capsule. Adolf Hitler dead by his own hand. But what if that's not the whole truth? This episode, we dive into the shadows of history with investigative author and historian Robert Hutchinson, who spent years digging into newly declassified intelligence, contradictory witness accounts, and government reports that raise serious doubts about the official narrative. Did Hitler really die in the bunker? Or was his escape covered up, buried in a fog of war, Cold War politics, and disinformation? U-boat routes to FBI files marked confidential will unravel one of the 20th century's most enduring conspiracy theories and ask the question that just won't die. What really happened to Adolf Hitler? Welcome to From the Void. All right, welcome to the podcast. Robert Hutchinson, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me on, John.
Absolutely. So you are scratching a couple of my itches here because I like interesting mysteries, but I also am a deep lover of history. My undergraduate degree is in history. And so, your book I found fascinating. And so it is obviously about World War II, specifically Hitler. But before we get into that, tell people a little bit about who you are and a little bit about the work that you do.
Oh, well, I am a writer of popular history mostly. What that means is I kind of specialize in taking very complicated subjects and trying to write for the general public. At least that's my kind of goal. First of all, because I don't have the training to be a serious historian and write 600-page books, but also I'm just personally interested in a lot of these things, and so I'll move from topic to topic. I specialize in early Christianity. That's where I actually have a degree in that. But it was sort of nice when the publishers of this series came to me and asked me to do these books. I was leaving the ancient world, the New Testament and early Christianity, for which the evidence and the documents are of certain challenges in terms of evidence, and coming kind of into our time, which was Abraham Lincoln, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, and then we did Hitler, and it was just like overwhelming cornucopia of evidence that you don't really have when you study the New Testament and ancient documents that are 2,000 years old and so on. So it was a lot of fun moving from the ancient past to the relatively more modern time of Abraham Lincoln and Adolf Hitler, just in terms of the amount of evidence and documentary material that you go over. I mean, I was startled to find that there were all these first-person accounts of the Civil War. And when I did the Hitler book, I mean, I found myself, my kids were kind of creeped out by it, but I found myself, reading all the memoirs of Hitler's valet and his secretary and you had all this material. And it was just amazing to go through it all. So anyway, that's my background. I'm kind of a popular historian, writer of popular history, and I try and take the very complicated debates of the professional historians and boil them down for ordinary folks.
Love that. And you kind of touched on my main podcast, which is on the topic of spirituality and Christianity in particular. So we might have some more things to talk about. We'll have to see. But so what you mentioned that you were approached to write on this series. Did they approach you with this particular topic, or was that just something that?
No, I pitched the idea of doing a series of books called the What Really Happened series to try and see on the kind of the big mysteries of history, to take the consensus of mainstream historians, not wild conspiracy theories necessarily, and try and come up with what you could reasonably say is this is what really happened. So we looked for mysteries or controversies that we could actually solve to a reasonable degree of certitude without, having any wild theories. And Abraham Lincoln's assassination and kind of what happened was something you could reconstruct pretty faithfully. And then Hitler's disappearance and what happened to Hitler was a mystery that seemed to endure. And as I was pitching these books, the History Channel, as you said, was doing a 3-year documentary series on, did Hitler escape? And that hadn't been settled yet. And the truth is, from a scientific point of view, it wasn't really settled until 2017 in terms of science, because of a lot of weird things that happened with the Soviets and deliberate disinformation campaign and all that I go into in my book. But anyway, that's what happened. I pitched this idea of doing a series of what really happened with the idea we'd eventually tackle subjects like the Twin Towers, maybe the assassination of John F. Kennedy, some of the really hard ones that are harder to say with confidence, this is what really happened. But on Lincoln and Hitler, I think we succeeded.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. And the thing that's most interesting to me is that I'm as I get older, I'm finding that a lot of the versions of historical events that I learned growing up in school, maybe perhaps like left out some details that were kind of important, that might lead you in a different direction if you are paying close attention. And so this is definitely one of them where, the story that we had heard is that, Hitler and his wife died in the bunker in Germany as Allied forces are closing in. You've got the Russians coming in, from the east, and the U.S. and British forces coming in from the west, and that seemed like that was that, And then you find out there are some strange details. The Soviets got there first, and so a lot of our accounts are based on what the Soviets told us. And so tell people what do we know for certain in terms of when the Soviets arrived and the evidence that was left behind?
Yeah, well, we know all that actually quite in detail, but most Americans don't realize that. First of all, half the American public in 1945 thought that Hitler had escaped, and it was a perfectly reasonable belief because no one had a body. The other thing people don't realize is that the U.S. Army did not enter Berlin for a full 2 months until the war ended. We basically made a political decision to allow the Soviets to capture Berlin and do what they would. And the worst fears of the German people, which was that they were going to be raped and some killed by an avenging Soviet army, came to be true. So we basically just let the Soviets have Berlin. And they got there and they took control. And then when we finally entered Berlin 2 months later, we said, well, what happened to Hitler? Where's Hitler's body? And the Russians told us, well, we don't know. We think he might have escaped. In fact, we think you might have helped him. And those, of course, made headlines around the world. And there were already in 1945 reports that Hitler had escaped on a submarine, probably, maybe to Argentina. These weren't crazy rumors because nobody had the body. At least as far as we knew, all they had was what the Nazis had reported, Nazi officials. And that was all the evidence that at least the U.S. Army knew about. So it was a perfectly reasonable thing to think Hitler might have gotten away because nobody had the body. In fact, when they finally wrote the official report of what happened, Hugh Trevor Roper, a British historian, wrote the first official account. He was hired by the British government to get to the bottom of this, and he wrote an actually amazingly good report. He only interviewed 7 Nazi survivors of the Fuhrer bunker, but he came very close to being right on the money. But he admitted at the end of his book, we have no idea what happened to Hitler's body. This is what we think happened, but we have no idea what happened to his body. This was right back then. Anyway, so this is how all these rumors got started. And as you said, yeah, we've gone 75 years before we finally sorted out the truth. This project has really taught me how messy history actually is.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when, you mentioned that that was a prevalent rumor in the initial aftermath of the war, and not helped by the fact that even Stalin himself kind of put something out there into the public as well.
Yes. It turned out it was a deliberate misinformation campaign. We talk about the Russians today and misinformation and all that. It was a deliberate misinformation campaign that the Soviets put out there that they didn't know what happened to Hitler. They knew exactly what happened to Hitler. They got the body 5 days later after and they took the body to a military station a few miles outside of Berlin, did an autopsy based on reconstructed dental records, and then they took the body and buried it in the Brandenburg Forest for about a year, and then they dug it back up and they put it in underneath a KGB safe house in the German town of Magdeburg, where it stayed for 25 years um, until 1970, when they were being forced to give East Germany back to the Germans, and they were afraid that the secret might get out, where they had secretly buried Hitler and Eva Braun's bodies and the bodies of the entire Goebbels family. And they were afraid that this might get out somehow and it would become a shrine to neo-Nazis. So they dispatched a team to dig up what was left of the remains of Adolf Hitler and the Goebbels family and Eva Braun. And this team took them out to an isolated location near a river, burned them again, and scattered the ashes in the river. And we have the accounts of the Soviet intelligence officers who did that in 1970 or so. So that's what happened to most of Hitler's body, but they kept the skull fragments and the jawbone. And they kept them for 75 years, and they wouldn't let anybody examine them. They kept one piece in a floppy disk, one of those old 5 1/4 floppy disk boxes, because the Soviets thought they were really cool and looked very, I don't know, forensic or something. And they kept the jawbone in a cigar box in the KGB secret headquarters, secret archives, until, they finally relented after the fall of the Soviet Union to allow Western experts to look at them. I know I'm rambling on, but it's kind of a fascinating story. And then in like 2007 or around that time, they finally allowed a Western pathologist, an American pathologist, to examine the skull fragments. And he said it couldn't have been Hitler's skull. It was a skull of a young woman. And there were headlines across the world. Maybe history got it wrong. Maybe Hitler really did escape, because this American pathologist said that. And the Soviets were so furious that their prize from World War II, proof that they had Hitler, was discounted, that they wouldn't even discuss somebody else looking at the remains for at least a decade. It took another decade to let them have outside Western experts examine the dental remains. And anyway, so that's the whole story. It took 75 years to get to the truth.
That's incredible. I mean, first you have sort of, this disinformation campaign and kind of perpetuating this idea that maybe he did escape, and then they try to use science, modern science, to prove that yes, he in fact did die in the bunker, and then it just keeps it going for another 10 years.
It did. And then the Obama administration released the secret FBI files on Hitler around that same time, 2010 or something like that. And that caused another flurry of headlines, because it turned out the FBI was looking into it. Like in the 50s, they kept sending agents down to Argentina. So they weren't entirely convinced. They didn't know. They were as much in the dark as anybody, because the Soviets had not told anybody the truth. So the FBI was looking into this into the 50s. So that caused another flurry of information. And all of this led to the History Channel finally doing a 3-year investigation into whether Hitler finally escaped. And I read all of the Hitler escape books. And what amazed me, and this is a lesson for people in terms of studying conspiracy theories, is you would have a 300-page book, and they would go into great detail about, the layout of the Berlin subway tunnels, the detail about the 2 Nazi submarines that did travel to Argentina at the end of the war. They would go into amazing details about the submarines and all that, and all the detail about the Nazi expats living in Argentina. But when it came to actual proof that Hitler was living among them, it was down to a couple of pages of hearsay. So-and-so told so-and-so, who wrote a memoir about it, but then lost the memoir, but he reconstructed it from memory. I mean, that's the kind of evidence these books had. It was almost laughable. Yet they sold millions of copies, and a lot of people, believe it because they had so much real detail on the stuff we do know. Lots of detail about the subways, lots of detail about the subs. But when it gets to like, okay, how do you know Hitler was in Argentina? Well, I met a guy who said he was his doctor, and he wrote his memoirs about taking care of Hitler, but then he lost his manuscript. But I can remember most of it. That's the kind of evidence we're talking about.
Yeah, I do want to spend some time on talking about, before we were able to confirm, and there was still speculation kind of floating around out there. It's not as inconceivable when you look at some of these other really high-profile Nazi officials who were able to successfully escape it. Some indefinitely died of natural causes. Some were eventually captured by the Mossad. But there were a series of big names like Joseph Mengele, Adolf Eichmann, who did make it to South America. So talk a little bit about how they were able to do so. Even how does one get out of this massive world war and make their way all the way to South, and why South America? That's the other interesting.
Well, the why South America is obvious. There was a large German expat community in many of these countries, Paraguay and Argentina and so on. That's all true. And as you said, it's also true that some top Nazis did escape. It's also true that the top Nazis were trying to get Hitler to escape. Up to the very last minute, they had a plane standing by, one of his top pilots that could have whisked him away, he and Eva Braun, and they were trying to pressure him into leaving. So all of that is true. So you can make a pretty strong case that, well, at the last minute, they got body doubles whom they just killed, and they maybe even faked dental records. They could have done that. And Hitler's dental records, by the way, were lost. They went down in an airplane crash along with some of his other records. So they don't actually have the dental records. What they have is the dentist's reconstruction of the dental records. The dentist who actually worked on Hitler's teeth. Hitler had horrible teeth. Hitler had only 4 natural teeth left. He had this elaborate series of implants and dentures and everything held together by bridge work. And so he had a very distinctive profile, let's put it that way, of his mouth. And we also have X-rays of his entire head that were done at one point fairly late that were in the hands of the U.S. Army. So that's also a pretty accurate photograph of what his mouth looked like. So we do have a lot of, but there's a lot of good reasons for thinking Hitler could have joined those expats, those top Nazis who fled. I think it's been largely debunked that there was the Odessa Files, right? That was a novel by Frederick Forsyth that was very popular. It was an organized kind of attempt, but that's been largely debunked. It was more of an ad hoc thing. When you read the accounts of the top Nazis, it was pretty pathetic, their attempts to escape. I mean, Himmler shaved his mustache and, things like that, and tried to say he was Sergeant so-and-so. And it was amazingly unorganized, actually. And that's why most of them got caught, is they didn't really have a good escape plan already put in place, or at least if they did, it didn't work. Because a lot of them got caught. But like the Grey Wolf says that Martin Bormann organized the escape of Hitler and Eva Braun and accompanied them to Argentina and organized all this, the chalet in the mountains and all that. But they found Martin Bormann's body in 1972. He's in East Berlin. They identified his body by dental records from the same physician who worked on Hitler's teeth, or the same dentist who worked on Hitler's teeth. And then later, I can't remember, in the 90s or maybe the early 2000s, they did DNA tests on the remains that definitively identified Martin Bormann, that that was the body they found in 1972. So that takes a big piece out of the Grey Wolf's. The Grey Wolf was one of the top conspiracy books that Hitler escaped, that the Grey Wolf contends that Bormann went with Hitler. So we almost certainly have Martin Bormann's body as well. So anyway.
Yeah, that's incredible. Talk a little bit about, one of the things I thought was interesting is that for those who did escape, there was what they call rat lines. Like, explain to people what is a rat line and how are they used?
Well, rat lines, of course, are on a boat. How the rats get off the ship. And there were networks, informal, I think mostly informal networks, because I said I don't think there was the Odessa organization. The Odessa was supposedly a very highly organized SS organization for ferrying Nazis out. But some people have been, getting money out of the country, billions of dollars in gold and so on. So some individual Nazis did have a network set up to escape. As I said, not as many of the top ones as you would think. Goering, was caught. Himmler was caught. They were all the top ones were caught. But some of the lower level people were able to escape on a rat line or a kind of a informal. They all had ad hoc arrangements that they were able to get to Argentina or Paraguay or all these places. So, yeah, I mean, so that again, it's the fact that those people did escape made it not so crazy that Hitler might have. I totally sympathize with the conspiracy theorists on this because, they didn't have a body. There were 2 Nazi subs arrived in Argentina on the coast. There was a large expat community there. It's not crazy. They had people flying out of Berlin. I think the last documented flight was April 28th when that female pilot went down one of the boulevards in Berlin there and escaped despite anti-aircraft fire and all that. It wasn't it wasn't a crazy idea that Hitler could have been on one of the last flights and escaped that way.
Yeah, and I think you add in, some of the structures and buildings and things that they're just now, in some cases, finding in South America. You see sort of this pattern or this trail where initially in Argentina, because of the government that existed at the time that was kind of Nazi-friendly, we'll say. And partly, as you said, it could be because of the enticement of this enormous amount of Nazi gold that's coming in.
Yeah, they recently just discovered an incredible hoard of Nazi paraphernalia and, giant solid gold eagles with Nazi swastika. In some apartment in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, I think they found, like this huge, almost warehouse in this house of Nazi stuff. So there were a lot of Nazis in Argentina. That's true. And the Hitler escape books play that up to the teeth, because it's, it makes the story credible.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you add in, as you said earlier, now we're starting to see the declassification of a lot of documents where the FBI and CIA, had some documents that showed that there was some interest in looking into reports from South America. And so it just kind of a perfect storm, it seems.
Yes, but when you actually go through them, I read all of the documents that were released to the FBI. You just download them. In fact, I think you can get them to this day. And I went through them one by one. And it turned out, like one of the reports was, a Los Angeles Examiner reporter was talking to a guy in a bar. And the guy in the bar said, yeah, he met Hitler on a beach off the coast of Argentina. And so this reporter told somebody else who said, oh, wow, that's exciting. And so they told him to go back and find the guy again. And he went back for a week and trying to find this source of his. But so this report that Hitler first landed on a beach in Argentina was literally a guy talking to another guy in a bar, and he didn't know his name, but it ended up in the files of the FBI, and so that's the kind of stuff we're dealing with. The evidence, hard evidence that people claim to have, so when you go through all of the FBI files, you realize, there's a lot of unconfirmed rumors. There's very, very little hard evidence. And yet they kept the files open because, it's Adolf Hitler. And if he might escape, they'd want to investigate it. But I think the lesson of all this is you have to be very skeptical of what you think you know, or even things that are in FBI files and so on. You got to look at each thing individually and say, is this real evidence or is this just a rumor or a hearsay report or whatever? That's been the lesson for me. I've become much more skeptical of the news or whatever.
When you said you were looking into, all these, as many of the firsthand accounts as possible, the people who are in his inner core, who are around him in the final days. And you mentioned that, there were, folks around him, advisors who are trying to get him to leave. What's your sense of why he decided it's not worth it? It feels like that there were at least some supporters who relocated to South America and were acting as if we'll rise up again at some point, but the leader, arguably the most evil villain in the history of the world, clearly didn't.
Yeah. That's a good question. He stated in his last will and testament, his so-called political testament and his personal will, that he fully intended to dine in Berlin and not escaping. He stated that was his intention anyway. So the conspiracy theorists would say that's just, it was just a smokescreen. But that he stated that as his intention. And then one of the last things he said, according to one of the witnesses, I can't remember if it was his valet or his chauffeur, as they were saying goodbye to him, someone asked him, well, what should we do now? And he said something cryptic like, wait for the coming man. In other words, he imagined that there would be someone else following in his footsteps who would rise up and then they could follow in his footsteps. Some sort of kind of Nietzschean view of kind of like cyclical history or something, that there's someone coming after me. And so look for him was one of the last things he said, actually, supposedly, according to this one eyewitness. Wait for the coming man. So maybe Hitler had an idea that somebody would come in his wake and he would die this Götterdämmerung, this kind of heroic death from German mythology, and someone would then rise up and take the mantle or take the torch from him. And then also, of course, as everybody points out, Mussolini's body had just been desecrated a couple of days before. There were radio reports about that. They had strung Mussolini and his mistress up by their ankles and desecrated their bodies in public. And Hitler was determined that that wasn't going to happen to him, that he wasn't going to be humiliated in that way by his enemies. So all of those things probably came together as his motivation for not trying to escape.
Yeah,
Going down with the ship and so on.
Yeah, exactly. It feels that way. And also, if that is true, and those were his final words, it does seem to fall in line with a lot of the reports about, how into like sort of mythology and the occult and things that he seemed to be fascinated with. So it does seem to kind of fall in line with what you would expect him to say in the end.
Something like that. Yeah, and some of his followers were even more into the occult than he was.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I suppose like a fitting end to talking about this would be in your research, outline for folks like how things really went down in the very end. Like what do you think the end looked like?
I think it was very close to what Hugh Trevor Roper said, which was that, after having a vegetarian final meal around 2:00, Hitler and Eva Braun retired to their private quarters in the bunker. Hitler probably followed the advice of his physician and used the double method to be sure he would die, which was to bite down on a cyanide capsule vial, a glass vial of cyanide, and while simultaneously shooting himself in the temple with his Walter pistol. And Eva Braun thought that would make her look ugly and wasn't about to be, do that. So she just bit down on the vial of poison. There was some controversy over whether he shot himself in the mouth or shot himself in the temple. And there's forensic debates about that. And there's differing eyewitness accounts of that among the people who entered right immediately after this all occurred. Then they basically wrapped Hitler's and Eva Braun's body in a carpet, took it upstairs outside of the bunker, and they threw it into a narrow artillery hole in the carpet and poured dozens of gallons of gasoline, which had been prearranged up there. There was so much shelling and so much gunfire at this point, the people that did this had to retreat to the door of the bunker, the escape door of the bunker, and throw a wet rag, which they lit onto the carpet, and it burst into flames, and it burned. They would go out when there was less fire. They'd go out and pour more gasoline for a couple hours. It burned for a couple hours. This is all watched by eyewitnesses, by the way. There were people in another like a gun tower who watched this whole proceeding. They didn't know they were being observed, but this was all watched by eyewitnesses. And then a couple hours later, they removed the still smoldering bodies to another bomb crater about 20 to 30 feet away and covered it all up. And then they went back down, and eventually everybody escaped. They all left, and except for the engineer, the engineer who ran the power plant in the bunker, and he was the last guy there when Soviet female troops came trooping in on May 1st, looking for Eva Braun's underwear and bras and stuff that they wanted to loot. I mean, you couldn't make this stuff up. Literally, he has his hands in the air like thinks he's going to get shot by Soviet guards, and all these Russian women come in saying, "Where's Eva?" And so that goes on. He finally goes. The Soviets come in. They start looking for Hitler's body, and after a couple of days, they found it. They found it in the crater. I think about May 5th. So maybe 4 days. It was hard to find because there were hundreds of bodies around the Chancellery building who just got killed in the war. There were bodies that kind of looked like Hitler. There were people that had little mustaches. So at first they said they had found Hitler's body. There was a news report, and then they had to admit that it wasn't Hitler's body. They got a bunch of eyewitnesses came out and said, no, that's not Hitler. But they eventually they found somebody who saw where the bodies had been placed in that crater, and they dug them up, and they took them to a military installation in Buk, and they used dental records to positively identify them from dental records or from reconstructed dental records. And And that's, as I said earlier, they then took the remains of them and the entire Goebbels family and Eva Braun, and they buried them temporarily in the forest and then dug them up and put them for 25 years in another place. And then in 1970, they incinerated them and scattered the ashes, but they kept skull pieces and the jawbone, Hitler's jawbone, that remained in Soviet archives for 75 years. So that's what really happened. And it took us till 2017 to 18 till it was finally published to finally prove that the Soviets actually did have Hitler's jawbone and teeth, and therefore he could not have escaped, because at least if he escaped without his jaw.
Probably not likely.
Probably not likely.
So do they still have possession?
Yes. Yes, they do.
Wow.
They still have. I don't know if it's still in a cigar box or not, but it was when I have the guy's book right here. When they finally got some people to examine it, they couldn't believe it that they brought up the dental remains and literally a cigar box. But they did finally scientifically determine in 2017, 18, around there, that those were Hitler's teeth.
Kind of a fitting end for the man who would be emperor of the world, you know?
Yes. Yes.
Wow. That is incredible. Well, thank you so much for coming on to talk about this. I would love to have you back on to talk about Abraham Lincoln's assassination. That's another interesting one.
Yes.
I had no idea that one as well, that there was any suspicion that perhaps John Wilkes Booth may have made it out alive. So that's another
There's
one.
that, and was he killed at the instigation of the Confederacy? There's a few conspiracy theories associated with Lincoln. What was John Wilkes? Did John Wilkes Booth say "sic temper tyrannis" from the box where Lincoln was, or did he say it from the stage?
Yeah.
So anyway,
interesting. Yes, we'll have to reconvene and talk about that one. That one's another fascinating one. But this one is absolutely fascinating, and I know it's been sort of out in the public again by virtue of the History Channel series, and everyone loves a good conspiracy. So thanks for shedding some light on this one, and thanks so much for coming on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks very much.
And that wraps up not just this episode, but the end of another season of From the Void. I want to thank each and every one of you for tuning in, sharing the show, and helping us grow this incredible community of curious minds. This season has taken us deep into the strange, the forgotten, and the unexplained. And I'm so grateful to have you along for the ride. Now, we're taking a short 1-week break, but don't worry, we're not going far. In fact, I've got something brand new for you. On Tuesday, September 2nd, I'm launching a brand new podcast called History on the Margins, where we explore the weird, the overlooked, and the underappreciated corners of history. So if you like From the Void, you're going to love this one. Same storytelling, same obsession with the truth hiding in plain sight, totally different lens. And then on Monday, September 8th, we're back with an all-new season of From the Void, just in time for fall. We're also rolling out a new format that's going to let us bring you more stories, faster, without sacrificing the deep dives and immersive sound design you've come to expect. So stay tuned, check out History on the Margins on launch day, and most of all, stay curious. This is From the Void.